In the last section, we tried testing out our application, and we saw that in fact it was rendering the correct number of rows, but as you can see over here, we're still not actually putting the item title on the screen as we would expect. So this is a little bit of an oversight on my part. It's a very, very small, tiny thing, total oversight on my part that did not originally come up when I put this application together. So essentially the issue that we're running into is, if you flip back over to your item model, inside the models directory, inside of here, we've got that from JSON method right here. And remember, this takes some parse JSON from the API and tries to put it into this model. So the issue that we're running into is that at some point in the future, we call the toMap function right here. And inside there, we have these two ternary expressions that are checking to see if the values of dead and deleted are true or false. So the issue here is that when we originally parse our model from JSON up here, we set the deleted and dead properties. But for stories, because remember we are loading up stories, but we're just calling them item models because we're sharing the same model for stories and comments. For stories, the API does not serve up a deleted and dead property. So these two properties right here get initialized to a value of null. And then later on, when we try to take this item model and turn it into a map to store into our database through all that repository code, we look at the dead and deleted properties. They are null, which are not valid values for a ternary expression like you see right here. So again, big kind of coming out of left field here. No big deal. To solve this thing, all we have to do is check to see if parse JSON at deleted or parse JSON at dead are null before we assign them to these two values. So to do that little check, we're going to use a fancy little operator that we get from Dart. The operator that we're going to use right after parse JSON deleted, we're going to put in question mark, and then false, like so. So what this does right here is it says, look at the value of parse JSON deleted. If that is equal to null, so if this is null right here, if the JSON had no deleted property, then default to using a value of false. That's what this question mark does. Now we'll do the same thing on dead right here as well. So here's the dead property. I'm going to default it to be false. And then there's one other default that I want to set up on here, or two others, excuse me, for kids, just in case we don't get a list of kids from the API. I'm going to put on a empty list right here. Again, this is just kind of hedging our bets in case the API ever doesn't serve up a list of kids. And there's one other place I want to do this. It's on the text property as well. So on text, if we don't get a text property from the API, I'm going to default this to be an empty string, like so. Okay, so again, just kind of making sure that the JSON that we get back from the API, we never 100% know what we're going to get because it's an outside service. And so by adding on these little null checks right here, we can kind of default these values when they come over from the API. So I'm going to save this file, and then I'll do a quick refresh again. And then hopefully this time everything's going to work. So you'll see we're doing the restart. We get the refresh kicking in. We get stream still loading, and much better. All right, there we go. So we now see item titles on the screen. And the other thing you might have noticed inside there, when we actually reloaded the list, you saw that there was the initial request that went out to fetch the top IDs. That's when we saw the text stream still loading. And then you saw that over time, they kind of like eventually resolved one at a time, and the instant each one resolved, we saw its individual content on the screen. And so we did not have to wait for the overall list to load before we showed anything on here. Now, even with this solution, it looks like we still have a little bit of error, so let's do just a tiny bit more debugging and continue in the next section. In the last section, we finally got our titles to display on here, but you'll notice that we still got a nasty error message. So good news, this actually was an error message that we did expect to see, or did expect. So the last error message we saw a little bit unexpected. This one is totally fine, and we've got some really good solutions to it. So I'm going to pull open my terminal where the error messages are currently being printed. You'll see that every one of these error message lines are numbered. So I'm going to scroll up to the top where I will find number 0 right here. And you'll see that something went wrong, essentially when we tried to add an item into our SQLite database. So I see right here TXN, which is short for transaction raw insert. So it's clearly when we tried to put an item into our database, something did not quite go as expected. Above line 0, you'll see the actual error message that was thrown. So the error message, we can kind of interpret it a little bit. It says database exception. Something went wrong due to a unique constraint. And so we were trying to insert an item with a particular ID. And essentially this thing is saying that we are trying to insert an item into our database with an ID that already exists inside the database. So what's that mean? Well, let's flip back over to our code editor, and I'm going to open up my repository.dart file. Remember, that's inside the resources directory. Inside of repository, I'm going to scroll on down to my fetch item method right here. So inside of fetch item, we were doing a for loop and iterating over all of our sources. And then once we eventually found the item, we then tried to back it up to all of our different caches. Now there's kind of a corner case here that we are running into. At present, we are seeing that error message because we are pulling our item out of the database, and then we immediately turn around and try to back up that same item to our database. So essentially, we just pulled a record out of the database, and we're trying to save it right back in, and it's the exact same data. And so it's an entirely pointless backup. We're seeing this error message in particular because the item that we're trying to save back into the database, like the one we just found, it has an ID of a record that already exists inside the database. And our database has a constraint that says every ID must be unique. So essentially, we cannot insert a new item into the database with the same ID as one that already exists. So, two different ways to solve this, two different ways. I'm going to show you a very easy, straightforward way first, and then we'll look at a little bit more complicated way. So first, the easy way. I'm going to open up inside my resources directory the news DB provider. So here's the DB provider. And then I'm going to scroll on down to my add item method right here. So this right here is essentially the line of code that is going wrong. We are trying to take the item that we just pulled out and shove it back in, and we're getting this kind of conflict. So as a name parameter to the insert method, we can optionally add in a name parameter of conflict algorithm. This conflict algorithm named parameter right here tells our database what to do if it ever runs into a conflict like it's seeing right here, where it's trying to insert an item with an ID that already exists inside the database. So there's a couple of ways that we can automatically have our database resolve this conflict, and all the different ways are listed as properties on a class called conflict algorithm. Algorithm. There we go. So this is a class that comes from the SQLite package. If you hover over it, you'll see that it says package SQFlite. And then listed on here are the different ways in which we can resolve the conflict. So we can abort, which is going to just cancel the insert entirely. We can fail, which is going to throw an error message. That's the default setting. We can ignore the error message entirely. We can replace the existing record, or we can attempt to do something called a rollback. And a rollback is only applicable when we're running code inside of a transaction, which is not what we're doing here and not quite appropriate for what we're talking about presently. So an easy way to solve the immediate issue we have is to tell our database that if it runs into this conflict, just ignore that error. Oh, there's an ID in there that already exists? Well, just ignore it, move on to the next item, don't throw an error. Okay, so that's the easy way of solving this. Now we'll take a look at a little bit more complicated way. So the little bit more complicated way of doing this would be to open up your repository.dart file. Here's the repository class. You'll recall that we have the list of sources and caches, and you'll notice that the newsDB provider, the exact same instance is listed in both, which is totally fine for the context of what we're trying to build here. But because this is the exact same instance, it actually gives us kind of a good opportunity to solve this kind of conflict issue. So let's scroll on down to the fetch item method. So the second way in which we could solve this would be to, inside of our backup for loop right here, where we try to back up our item to our cache, we could check to see if the cache variable that we are iterating over right here is the exact same value in memory, or the exact same class instance as the source that we just got our item from. So we can do a simple comparison, and we can say if this cache variable is the same thing as the source that we just got the item from, then don't try to back it up and just skip this step right here. So to do so, inside the for loop, we can say if cache does not equal source. So if these are two different places that we're getting this information from, then go ahead and do the backup step, like so. So now if the cache that we're currently looking at is the exact same object as the source that we just got it from, skip over this if statement and move on to trying to back up our item into the next cache in our list. Now you'll notice that we get the green underline right here. It says equality operator invocation with references of unrelated types. So this is a little bit unfortunate. Essentially, it's saying we are trying to compare equality between a value of type cache right here and a value of type source right here, even though you and I very, very much well know that these are the exact same instances in memory. But as far as Dart is concerned, we are trying to compare types of cache and source, and that is a essentially undefined operation that I would definitely expect to raise an error. So to solve this equality comparison right here, there's a couple of different things we can do. First off, we could leave this source variable up here as untyped. So I could just say var source. Now source is dynamic. And now, as far as Dart is concerned, oh yeah, I can compare a dynamic value with a cache value. No issue there. So that's one way. Another way would be to try to take our source, add in a set of parentheses around it, and then say as, and then list out the type of thing that we want to have Dart consider this variable to be. And so we could say, just imagine that the source is actually a cache, like so. And of course, we could do the opposite as well. We could say cache as source. So that's going to tell Dart, just pretend that this cache is a source and then try to compare the two. Now, this definitely works right now for our existing code where we have just this one object common in between, or we have this one cache right here. And so we're only ever going to be comparing this object to its same counterpart over here. But if we started having truly different objects between the two, doing this comparison, I would kind of expect this as operator to not work quite as we expect. So we're just going to take the easy way out. We'll just leave source as untyped. And in this case, Dart is going to say, okay, no problem. I'll try to compare equality between these two. All right, so let's save this. I'm going to refresh my terminal again. And we'll wait for that to kick in very quickly. There we go. And so now we see all of our items resolve, no error messages over here, and we have fetched 53 items. Awesome. All right, so this is looking good. We see no error messages. We're definitely fetching the bare minimum amount of data. I think that we're on a great track. Let's take a quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section. The functionality of our app is certainly coming along, but it certainly looks quite ugly. So right now we just got a very plain list of titles. Remember that our ultimate goal was to get this kind of a nice looking list right here where we show some individual tiles. Every tile will show the title of the story, the number of votes, a little comment icon, and then the number of comments underneath that icon. And we're probably going to want to see a nice little border or kind of divider in between each of these items. So in this section, we're going to start working on taking each of our item models and producing a little widget that looks like this. So to add this in, I'm going to open up my code editor again, and I'm going to find my news list tile widget. So remember, this is the widget that is responsible for eventually resolving and receiving an item model, and then showing that individual tile on the screen. I'm going to scroll down. Here's the future builder. So inside the future builder, we get that item snapshot, and as soon as that item snapshot has data, that is our item model right there. So we need to take this item snapshot.data property, and we need to turn it into a widget that's going to produce all this information. Now, if we add all that logic for rendering out that widget to show the nice looking tile inside the future builder, that would be a little bit complicated to look at. So rather than putting all the logic for that directly inside a future builder, I'm going to add on a helper method to our class. This will return a widget. It'll be called build tile, and it's going to take an item model that we'll call item. So the goal of this method right here is to take our item model and produce this. That's what we want to make. Now I'm going to make sure that back inside my future builder, I no longer return a text widget, Instead, I'm going to call build tile, and I'm going to pass in our item model, which is referenced inside of here as item snapshot.data, like so. So item snapshot.data is our item model. All right, so now we can get to work on the build tile method right here. So inside of build tile, we're going to return a widget called list tile. So we used this list tile widget very briefly a while back. Remember that this is a built-in Flutter widget that is used to make nice looking tiles exactly like the one you see right here. So if you want to, you can always pull up the docs.flutter.io page, and we can take a look at list tile. And as usual, we haven't done this in a while, but as usual, we'll scroll on down directly to our constructor. So inside of here, we can pass in a title. So that's going to be the article title. We can do a subtitle. The subtitle is this kind of hit text lower on down here. And then we can also provide a trailing property. Here it is right here. Trailing is going to be whatever we want to show on the right-hand side. So that's going to be like our comment and the number of comments underneath it. Again, that is the trailing property. All right, so let's flip back over. So to our list tile, excuse me, it's a tough one. We're going to add in a title of item.title. Now we get a little red underline there. My mistake. We don't want to pass in the title directly. We want to wrap that inside of a text, like so. We're going to do a subtitle, which will again be a text that's going to look at the item model. And remember our item model, let's pull open the model itself right here. It has that score property. And so score is the number of votes that it has. So we're going to reference that score property for the subtitle. So back over here, here's the subtitle property. We're going to pass it text, and that's going to get item.score. Now, a little bit of an issue here. Text always expects to receive a string, but item.score is an integer. So we're going to coerce this thing to a string by using that string interpolation syntax like so. And then just to kind of match up with our mockup, back over here, you'll notice how it says 10 votes. So I would really like it if this thing said 10 votes rather than just the integer of like 10. So after the curly braces for item.score, I'm going to add in, how about points instead? We could do points or votes, whatever one you want to do. And I think that's good for now. Let's do a save and we'll test this out inside of our emulator just to make sure that we're going down the right path. So I'll do a quick refresh. And there's our refresh. Awesome. Now that is looking pretty darn good. Okay, so let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section and we're going to start putting together the right-hand side icon and number of comments over there. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we started adding in this build tile method. Our application looks a lot better than it did before. We're now going to start working on getting the right-hand side trailing thing to show up. So remember on that trailing property, we want to have the comments icon and the number of comments listed directly underneath that. As a quick reminder, to get the number of comments on our item model class, we want to look at that descendants property. So descendants right here is the number of comments that a particular story has. All right, okay, so back over at build tile, I'm going to add on a trailing property. Now for the trailing portion over here, we want to show the icon, the comments icon, and directly underneath it, we want the number of comments. So to get this type of layout right here, we're going to be making use of a column widget. So remember, trailing right here, it accepts a single widget, but we want to show multiple widgets. So to get both widgets to show up on top of each other, we'll use a column to wrap the two. Inside there, we'll add on our children property, which is going to be the list of widgets that we want to show inside this. And then we'll first show our icon. So I will put in the icon widget, and remember to show an actual icon here, we do icons.comment, like so. And then underneath that, we'll put our text widget, and that's going to be our number of descendants. Now this is going to have a little bit of a gotcha. Remember back up here on item model, inside of from JSON, we've got this descendants property right here. So there are particular types of stories that do not have a descendants property. For example, you can post job advertisements on Hacker News. And whenever you post a job advertisement, there are no comments allowed. So in that case, if we are trying to show a story that is actually a job advertisement, descendants right here is going to show up as null, just like it did for all these other properties that might sometimes be null as well. And so to solve that issue, let's put in another one of those question mark operators. So if we get no descendants showing up here, if that's a null property because it is a job post, we'll just default that value to be 0, like so. So now back over here, inside of build tile, we'll show the comments icon, and then we'll put in item.descendants, like so. And again, we're making use of that string interpolation syntax because item.descendants is an integer, and to use a text widget, we have to provide a string. All right, let's do another save, another refresh, and see how we're doing. Okay, and that looks pretty darn good. So now we can scroll through a little bit, and we'll see that all these different stories have some number of comments associated with them. Not bad. Now, right here, here's a great example of a job post. So ZeroCater is hiring a full stack engineer in SF, and you'll notice that this thing has a value of null right here. So this is a job post. The reason we're seeing null right here is because we have already received this item and has been saved to our database with a value for descendants of null. So we put in that little null check over inside of our item model a little bit too late to solve this one. If you see an item with null here, a very easy way to fix it would be to reset your database. Remember, to reset your database, you can open up your NewsDB provider. And then inside the NewsDB provider class, you can find the init method right here, and you can just change the name of the database. So I might go over to, say, items 4. That's going to be completely reset the database, or in reality, recreate it. And so now we're going to retrieve that item from our API. And when we retrieve it from the API, our from.json method will see that it has a descendants property of null, and so it will default it to be 0 instead. So now when I do my refresh, I can scroll down again. And when I see that job post, I don't even see where it is now. I probably already skipped over it. I don't know, somewhere inside of here. Anyways, no, is that it? Well, you get the idea. Somewhere inside of here, we'll see that it is 0 rather than the null that it was before. And of course, for here it is right here, ZeroCater. Now it's 0, which is totally appropriate. Okay, so this is looking good. Let's take a quick break. And I think the last thing we have to do is make sure that we get a divider of sorts in between each of these items. So we'll take care of that in the next section. The last big thing that I want to do around all of our list item tiles is to make sure that we get a divider in between each one. So showing a divider here is going to be pretty straightforward. Back inside my build tile method, this creates a tile. So all we have to do is wrap our tile, the list tile right here, with a column widget, and then show a divider widget underneath it. So we can either apply this column, either up here inside of our builder, when we call build tile, or we can wrap the list tile right here with a divider. Either way. I think that we'll wrap this list tile right here with a column and show the divider inside of it. So anytime that we call build tile, we get like a fully qualified, ready to render tile. So to do this refactor, I'm going to give myself a little bit of space at the top of the method, and I'm going to return a column that has the children property. And then inside of the children, I'm going to take the entire list tile that we just put together, I'll cut it, and I'm going to paste it in there as the first element to children. So I'm going to take not the return statement, I'm going to take everything from list tile all the way down to its closing parenthesis, but note that I'm not getting the semicolon. So I'm going to cut that, and I'll paste it inside of children, like so, and then just fix up the indentation and put a comma at the end. I'll then go back down to the bottom of the method, and I'm going to clean up that return keyword. Cool. So now on children, after we show the list tile, I'm going to put another entry inside of here, and this will be our divider element. So I'll put in a divider, and we'll save this, and we'll do a quick refresh and see how we're doing. Okay, so we can now see, it's very hard to see on my screen at least, maybe it's a little bit more evident for you. We can very easily see that there is a divider between each one of these tiles. Now, something that I don't quite like in here right now is that you'll notice that if we have a item or a story right here that has just a single line of text, you'll notice that it seems like there's a little bit too much space between the divider and the actual item itself. So if we want to, we can set a height on the divider that controls the amount of height above and below this thing that's going to be displayed. So on the divider, I can set a height of, say, 8.0 like so, and that's just going to kind of shrink down or kind of skinny down the divider in the space above and below it. So let's try doing another refresh now. And now, there we go. It's just a little bit more compact than it was. And so if you want to, you could play around with this height property right here and adjust it until you feel like there's a good amount of spacing in between each item. Okay, so I like this, but there's one issue I want you to notice. So remember, our item builder, or the list view builder, not even inside this file, it's inside of our news list. So here's the news list file, news list class. Down inside of build list, we've got the list view builder. And remember, this thing is going to attempt to fetch all the items that it thinks it needs to render on the screen. So when you see our fully rendered tile right here, I only have the ability to see like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then maybe beneath it there's like a 9 and 10 down there as well. So only 10 items can be actually displayed on the screen at a time when our tile is fully rendered. However, right now, when we initially render everything to the screen, like when we first load up that list tile and we show that stream builder with the message of stream still loading right there and still loading item blah 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 right there, that is setting a height on our news list tile which is very small. It's a very short element. And so when our list view builder right here does that initial render of the news list tile, it looks at that very initial height of the news list tile. It sees that height in there of like maybe 10 pixels, and it thinks that it should be rendering like 50 elements down the screen because all those news list tiles can be very easily kind of stacked on top of each other. And so when our application first loads up, it's fetching 53 items, even though when everything gets fully rendered, we only really need to see 8 at a time. And so I think that we need to figure out some strategy to get a very consistent height on these list tiles at all times so that we do not accidentally confuse our list builder into thinking, oh yeah, I need to show like 53 things, so I'm going to attempt to fetch 53 things. Remember, we want to just fetch the absolute bare minimum amount of information. And so at the end of the day, when we first refresh our application and we see this printout right here, remember this printout is coming from my stories block, the scan stream transformer right here. So I'm printing out the index. That's the number of items that we're fetching right here. Just a quick reminder. I really only want to see us trying to fetch like 10 items or so at max when our application first loads up, not the 53 that we're currently getting. So long story short, we need to figure out a way to keep our news list tile widgets much more consistent in height than they currently are. So let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section and figure out how we might be able to address that. In the last section, we spoke about how we need to somehow convince our list view that each one of these list tiles has a very consistent height so that the list view does not attempt to overfetch our data. Now there's a couple of ways that we can achieve this. The most basic way that we could achieve this is to find our news list tile right here. And then inside of our build method, right now we are returning that stream builder. We could wrap this stream builder with a container that has a set height. And that's something that we did back when we initially did that very quick demo of how we were going to work with a stream builder and future builder. You recall we just created a container with a height of like 80 pixels, and that convinced our item builder that it could only show like 6 items at a time. So that's definitely one way we could do it, but I'm thinking that we could take this opportunity to give our users a little bit better data loading experience. So let me show you something really quick. Right now, if I go over to youtube.com, I want you to watch what happens when I initially load up the page. So watch this. You see how it's like gray right there? That is as YouTube is attempting to fetch data. It does not know what it wants to put in for each of those items yet, but it does know that it's going to have the image, the title, and like some information underneath it. And so that's kind of a stand-in widget that is displayed as YouTube is attempting to actually fetch its data. And it kind of gives your users a little bit of a good idea of what the UI is going to eventually look like. And so I think that would be something really cool for us to do. I think that before we actually successfully get this item's title and subtitle underneath it, we should just try to show two like gray rectangles that kind of maybe span like 3/4 of the screen's length or width, and just have that be a stand-in until we eventually actually load up the item model and successfully show the title and subtitle underneath it. So that's the idea. Let's make kind of a little stand-in widget that can be displayed inside of here, inside of our news list tile, until we actually get our data. So to put this thing together, we're going to need a couple of different widgets. I'm going to first create a new widget inside my widgets directory. We're going to call this thing a loading container. And the sole purpose of this thing is going to be to create a kind of gray rectangular box with some set height and width. We absolutely could put all the code for this directly inside of newslist tile, but this file is already getting a little bit large. Let's see, it's at about 54 lines right now. And so I think it would be a good idea to kind of break this loading thing out to its own separate widget. So inside my widgets directory, I'm going to make a new file called loading_container.dart. Okay, so again, loading container.dart. At the top, we will import package flutter material.dart, and we'll make our class loading container. That's going to extend stateless widget, like so. This thing will have a build method that gets called with some context. And then inside of here, we are going to want to somehow get our container to kind of like span some width on this thing. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back to the next section and start implementing the loading container. In the last section, we started putting together this loading container widget whose job is going to kind of show some gray loading boxes to our user. Now, I'm specifically calling this a container just because it uses containers to show that gray kind of aspect to it. We could have just as easily, and maybe would have been more appropriate to call this loading like list tile or something like that, because that's essentially what it is, but whatever, we call it container, that'll do. So inside of here, we're going to essentially create the exact same list tile that we just made a moment ago, where we've got the column, a list tile inside of it, and a divider. But rather than having a title of the actual item model's title and a subtitle of whatever, we're going to give it some gray containers to show instead, or essentially gray rectangles, really. So back over here, inside of loading container, I'm going to return a column that's going to have some children. The first child is going to be a list tile, and then the second one will be a divider. And again, I'm going to give this thing a height of 8 pixels just to keep it kind of consistent with what my final loaded tile looks like. Then inside of the list tile itself, I'm going to add in a title property and a subtitle property. So again, these are both going to show gray boxes that span the entire length of the screen. Now, each of them is going to be an identical gray box that consists of a container element. So rather than putting the container together here and then kind of copy pasting it down to subtitle, I'm going to make a helper method inside of here that is going to construct the kind of loading box or gray box thing for us. So inside of my class, I'm going to add on another method that's going to return a widget called build, I don't know, build box, build container, whatever. Either way, inside this thing, we are going to return a container. We're going to set the color on this thing right away. So I'm going to give it a color of colors.gray. So that's going to be kind of our loading color. Now, we've used this color property several times before. And remember, if you're using VS Code, you can mouse over this thing and take a look at all the different colors that are available. Now, if you look at the default gray right here, I don't know about you, but that looks just a little bit too dark to me. I kind of would like to have one of these 200s or 300s right here that are a little bit lighter. So to use these different properties, or this gray 200 or 300, we can just add on exactly what it showed inside that little tooltip. We add on 200, like so, and that gives us a slightly lighter gray color, which I think is going to work out pretty well for our purposes. Okay, so we now got the container with a color, But when we render a container, by default, it tries to size itself just to contain its children. If it doesn't have a child, then it's going to shrink to be as small as it possibly can, unless we set up some type of height and width on it. So on this thing, I'm going to assign a height, and we'll just kind of guess here. I'm going to use a height of 24 pixels and a width of like 150 pixels. Again, just kind of guessing here. And then I'm going to also give this thing a little bit of margin, because we're going to use the container right here as both the title and subtitle. And we definitely don't want them to be sandwiched up against each other. We probably want these things to have a little bit of standoff or offset. So I'm going to add on, remember it's the margin property. I'll give this thing edge insets, and I only want to add in some margin on the top and bottom. So I'll add in top of 5.0 and bottom of 5.0, like so. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We'll now go back up to list tile. And for the title, I will put in a build container. And for the subtitle, I'll put in build container. Cool. All right, so that looks good for our loading container. Let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section and we'll try integrating this thing into our actual news list tile widget. In the last section, we finished up our loading container widget, and we're now ready to use it inside of our news list tile. So remember, the entire idea here is that rather than showing that very plain and basic text for the stream builder and future builder, as we're waiting for the stream and the individual items to load, we want to show that loading container instead. And so that's going to give us a more consistent height, which is going to make sure that our actual item builder is only going to fetch the minimum number of records. So I'm going to find my stream builder. I'm going to find where we check to see if our snapshot has any data. Rather than always showing this text right here, I'm going to instead replace it with that new loading container. And then I'll do the same thing on my future builder. So rather than showing this text right here, I'll show loading container. Cool. Now you'll notice that it is red right here. It's because we have not actually imported this widget into this file. So let's make sure we do that. I'll go up to the top and I'll be sure to import loading container .dart. Cool. All right, so that looks good. So now when our news list tile is first rendered onto the screen and we're still waiting for data to show up, we're going to show these kind of placeholder things rather than our actual tile. So I'm going to flip back over to my terminal. Now notice that I still have all those print statements on here for getting a sense of how many items we're trying to fetch. So now that we are going to, in theory, always have a much taller widget on the screen, our list view is going to think that it has to render fewer items, and so we should see a far lesser number here than the 53 items it's currently trying to fetch. So I'm going to do my refresh. Wait for the refresh. There it goes. All right, so that is pretty neat. Notice how that we have a much more consistent height of element now, and so we see just 10 items trying to be loaded from our API. Now, when it reloaded, it looked a little bit funky with the loading tile over here, so let's do that again, and I'm going to look on the right-hand side just to see what that looks like. So over here, okay, I think that looks pretty reasonable. I think that kind of gray box gives a very clear signal to our users of, hey, we're still kind of fetching information, but here's what the app is going to eventually look like. It's got the gray box at the top that's going to represent the title, and then a second little box underneath it to represent the kind of subtitle down here as well. So I think that this is looking pretty darn good. So if I refresh again, and I see those kind of stand in, and then eventually resolves. Cool, so this looks great. Now there's still a little bit of work that we need to do on this list right here before we move on to the second screen. Remember, that is our detail screen, which I don't think I have the diagram up for right now. But again, just a little bit more work on here. Let's continue in the next section. Our application is looking pretty darn good, but we've got a very subtle little issue inside of here right now. So on the screen on the left-hand side, I've got the real Hacker News website loaded up, and then on the right-hand side is our current application. So you'll notice that the titles of all these top stories match up perfectly with the current top titles over on the real Hacker News site. So I see states can require internet tax collection, states can require internet tax collection. However, you'll notice that this story right here, according to Hacker News, has 283 points and 339 comments, whereas my application says that it's 254 and 312. So it's clear that maybe the data that we're showing over here is not quite as up to date as what's actually going on the real website. So let's think about what's happening here. Remember, every single time that we initially fetch that top list of IDs, we take those top IDs, and then we look through our repository, and from this repository, we loop over all of our different sources. And so we are going to either get a cached version of our story from our database provider, or we get a up-to-date, very recent copy of the story from the API provider if it does not already exist inside the database provider. And so that's kind of the issue. The first time that we fetch a story, we then take it and we instantly back it up into the database provider. And we have absolutely no logic whatsoever to then eventually go and update the data inside of the database provider. So essentially the first time that we fetch a news story right now, that is pretty much the first and last time that we're going to fetch that story from the API. So the instant we fetch a story, it's never going to actually get updated again. So even if this top story right here ends up getting like 5,000 points and 5,000 comments, you and I are always going to be stuck at 254 points and 312 comments. So I think it's clear that we probably need a way to either automatically kind of expire values that are stored inside of our database provider right here after some amount of time, or we need a way for our users to be automatically able to kind of purge all the values inside of here. If they think, hey, you know what, these stories look a little bit old, I want to get the most up-to-date copy of everything. So let's continue the next section, and we'll think about how we can implement some way to either automatically expire records or allow our users to kind of purge this cache right here. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we spoke about how we're always going to show kind of stale data on the screen, and we don't really have any ability whatsoever to refresh what is being shown. Now, we laid out two possible solutions. We could do some either automatic expiration of our cache, or we can allow our users to forcibly refresh all the elements on the screen. So we're going to go with the second option here. We're going to allow our users to say, hey, give me the most up-to-date set of information possible. So the way that we're going to implement that is allow our users to use a pull to refresh mechanic. So on the list right here, we're going to say that if the user pulls down on it, kind of like drags down, or essentially tries to scroll up, we're going to show a little indicator on the screen right here that tells the user that we are going to attempt to refresh data for them, and then we'll automatically show that new data on the screen. Now, normally doing this pull to refresh mechanic with a lot of other mobile frameworks is a little bit challenging, but with Flutter, very, very easy, relatively quite straightforward. So let's take a look at some Flutter documentation that's going to tell us exactly how to do this kind of pull to refresh mechanic. All right, I'm going to flip on over to my Flutter documentation. Again, docs.flutter.io. At the top right-hand side, I'm going to do a search for a widget called refresh indicator. So here it is, refresh indicator class. This is a widget that supports the swipe to refresh idiom, or essentially it is a widget that is going to allow us to automatically tell a list that we want it to be able to be kind of swiped down to refresh it. Now, as usual, we'll take a look at this thing's constructor. So here's our constructor. This thing has two name parameters that you and I care about. The first off is the child parameter. So the child, which we are required to pass in, is going to be the list that we want to wrap. So we are going to take that list view builder that we created inside of our news list widget, and we're going to wrap that list view builder with the refresh indicator. So we're going to pass in the list view as the child. By passing it in as the child, that is telling Dart that we want this thing to be essentially swipeable to refreshable, so to speak. Now, the other important name parameter is onRefresh right here. So the onRefresh parameter is a function. We can click on refresh callback right here to learn more about the function. So it is a function. From the function, we have to return a future. And once that future is resolved, that means that the refresh operation is finished, and we want the kind of spinner that's going to be displayed up here to go away. So that's pretty much it. We just have to create this refresh indicator widget, pass in our list, pass in a callback, and that's all we got to do. So let's take a quick break right here, and we're going to take care of all the implementation in the next section. In the last section, we started talking about using a refresh indicator to allow our users to refresh data on the screen. So let's get started on the implementation. Now, like we just discussed in the last section, inside of our news list, we can find our build list method right here. And here's our list view builder. So this right here, this is the widget that we have to pass as a child to the refresh indicator class. So we absolutely could just put like right in front of this thing, we could say refresh indicator and child, and then pass in the list view builder. But remember that we've got that callback on there. And I think that this widget that we're putting together right now is already looking a little bit complicated. So if we try to stuff in all this additional logic of the refresh indicator inside of here, I think life is just going to get a little bit confusing. So I think that we should make a separate widget file, and that separate widget file will have the logic to create the refresh indicator and then implement some refresh method that will automatically refresh all of our data for us. So inside my widgets directory, I'm going to make a new file called refresh.dart. And then inside of here at the top, we will import package flutter material.dart. I'll then create a class of refresh, and that's going to extend stateless widget. And then inside of here, we'll define a build method that receives some context like so. Okay, so the refresh thing that we're putting in together here is definitely going to be needing to return a refresh indicator, without a doubt. And we need to provide to this thing a child widget. So in other words, our refresh class right here is going to have to receive as an argument to its constructor a child that is going to be eventually forwarded onto this refresh indicator. So I'm going to make sure that I add on an instance variable that we will call child. So I'll say final type widget child, and we will create a constructor where this will be assigned from. So we'll say this.child like so. So now anytime we create this refresh widget, we have to pass a child into it. That child will be assigned to our instance variable right here, and we're going to take that child and pass it through to the refresh indicator right here. So we'll say child is the child instance variable, like so. Okay, let's now take this widget. We've not yet set up refresh indicator all the way. Remember, we also have to put together that on refresh callback inside of here, but let's go wire it up to the news list right away, just so we don't forget that step. So I'm going to go back over to my news list screen. At the top, I'm going to import the widget that we just created. And then down inside the build list method, I'll find where we create the list. So rather than returning this list view directly, we're going to instead return refresh. And then as a child, I'm going to pass in this whole list view builder thing that we're putting together right here. Now notice that we've got quite a crazy set of closing parentheses and curly braces right here. So make sure that you find the parenthesis that maps up to the opening parenthesis of the list view builder. Now I've got everything right there. As usual, I'm not copying the semicolon. I'm going to cut all that, and then I'll paste it in as the child. On the closing parenthesis of the list view builder, I'm going to add a comma so this thing doesn't collapse. And then I'll clean up the old return statement, like so. And I'll save, and my formatting kicks in. Okay, so that looks good. We'll now go back over to our refresh widget now that we've wired this thing up. Inside the refresh widget, we need to make sure that we implement that on refresh callback. So back inside of the refresh widget that we just created, we need to add on refresh, and this thing is going to have a function that has to return a future, and when that future resolves, the refresh indicator is going to go away. So another quick break, we'll come back to the next section, and we'll start to implement this on refresh method. In the last section, we put together our refresh indicator. The last thing we have to do is implement this on refresh callback right here. So inside of on refresh, we're going to want to write some code that is going to reach out over to our SQLite database and attempt to dump all the cached items that are inside of there, because that's how we're going to trigger an actual update. Remember, we need to dump everything inside the database so that our provider or more correctly, our repository doesn't try to reach into the database to fetch these very outdated items. Now, unfortunately, our onRefresh method right here is not going to reach directly over to our database provider. Instead, we're going to have a little bit more of a convoluted setup. So here's the idea. We've got our refresh indicator with its onRefresh callback. We do not want the refresh indicator to directly reach out to the database provider. Remember, it's the stories block that is really the central coordinator of all flows of information inside of our app. So the refresh indicator is going to reach out to the stories block, and it's going to tell it, hey, stories block, I really need you to dump all the cache values. The stories block, in turn, will reach out to the repository, and the stories block will say to the repository, hey, repository, go through all of your different caches and dump all the information inside them, because we're going to do a complete wipe here and start off with a clean slate. So then the repository needs to then look over to the database provider and say, hey, database provider, dump all the items inside of your items table. So that's the flow. So we are going to have to work through a couple of different files here to implement all this. We're going to first begin inside of our DB provider and then work our way backwards. So we're going to first write the logic to look into our items table where we save all of our different items and dump everything inside there. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my resources directory, and inside there, I'm going to open up the DB provider. So here's my news DB provider. I'll then go down to the very bottom of this class where I will add on a new method. So we're going to add on a new method called simply clear. And the idea here is that anytime we call it clear, we're going to look into our database. We're going to find that table of items, because remember, that's the table that holds all of our information, and we're going to delete everything inside there. So fortunately, to delete all the items inside of a table is a pretty straightforward process. All we have to do is get that DB instance variable. We'll call delete, and then we'll pass in the name of the table that we want to wipe all of our items from. And that is, for us, items, like so. Now remember, this is supposed to be the table name right here. So if you used a different table name when you first set up your database, you'll want to change that string to be whatever your table's name is. All right. Now, as you might imagine, deleting all the items inside of that table is an asynchronous operation. In other words, it takes some amount of time for that operation to be completed. And as you might guess, we do not want our refresh indicator to go away from the screen until that entire delete process is complete. So to make sure that we kind of communicate the fact that this takes some amount of time to be completed, we're going to return the result of calling db delete right here. In fact, if you hover over db delete, you'll see that it returns a future. And when that future is resolved, that means that all of the rows inside of our table have been deleted. So from this method, I'm going to just return that future like so. Okay, so that's it. That is our DB provider. So we'll now go back to the repository, and we're going to add a method on the repository to reach out to our DB provider and call that new clear method. So I'm going to close this file, and I'll open up my repository inside the resources directory. Now, quick reminder here, I've been saying, oh yeah, we're going to go directly to the DB provider, but we wrote our repository to have any number of caches. And technically, if we're doing a full refresh here, we probably want to dump all the information from all the possible caches that we have. So we're not going to reach directly just into this news DB provider. Instead, we're going to loop over all of our different caches, and we're going to call this new clear method on each and every one. So to start, I'm going to go down to the bottom of this class, and I'll add on a new method called clear cache, like so. And then inside of here, we're going to loop over all those different caches. So I'm going to say for var cache in caches, and we're going to call cache.clear. Now remember, when we call cache.clear, that's going to return a future. And since we want to make sure that every one of these caches have deleted all their information, I'm going to add in the await keyword in front of this to indicate that, hey, we're going to wait for all these caches to be cleared. So call cache.clear and then wait for it to be cleared and then move on to the next one and start clearing that one. Now, two errors pop up right here. So the first error that we have is on await. So because we're using await inside of a method, we have to make sure that we mark the method as async. So that takes care of the first error. And then the second error that we get right here, it says the method clear isn't defined for the class cache. So quick reminder, inside of our repository, we had created the idea of this abstract class cache, which kind of set up a contract of sorts and said, if you want to qualify as a cache, you have to implement this method called addItem. So we're now kind of adding on this additional requirement to our contract. We're saying now that if you want to qualify as a cache, you also have to implement a method called clear. We're seeing the error right here because we have not added that method to the definition of our abstract class. So if I go to my abstract class definition down here, I can add on a method called clear like so. And that now updates my abstract class to say, hey, the contract now is you have to implement both addItem and you have to implement clear. Now, if we want to, we could certainly annotate the return type of the clear method right here. We would first have to annotate the type inside of our NewsDB provider. Well, let's just go through that process just because it's good practice. So back inside of my NewsDB provider, here's the clear method we just put together. If you hover over delete, you'll see that when we call delete, it in fact does return a future that resolves with an integer. And if you scroll down here, I believe that integer right there is the number of rows that get deleted. I could be wrong, but I believe that's what it means. So I'm going to mark clear as having a return type of future with an int, like so. And then I'll go back over to my repository. Here's the repository file. Here's abstract class cache, and I'm going to annotate the return type of this clear method, like so. Oops, future, there we go. So again, now if we ever add any other caches to our application, they're going to have to implement both addItem and clear. Okay, so that looks good. We've now taken care of everything up to our repository. So again, working backwards here, and you know what, the section's running just a little bit long, so let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section, and we'll wire that stuff up to our stories block, and then finally to the refresh indicator. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we added the ability for our database provider to clear all the items inside of our items table. We then wired that up to our repository, and now it's time to connect that to our stories block so that the refresh indicator can eventually call that method. So I'll open up my code editor, and I'm going to find my stories block inside the blocks folder. So here's stories block. I'm going to scroll down, and then underneath my fetch top IDs method, I'll add a new method inside of here called clear cache. So inside this thing, all we have to do is reach out to our repository and call that new clear cache method on it. Now remember, the repository is available inside of our stories block as an instance variable called _repository. So back down here on clear cache, I'm going to return the result of repository.clear cache. Oops, underscore. And that's it. That's all we got to do. Now, one quick thing that's a little bit confusing inside of here, okay? This is a little bit challenging thing to understand about async code in the Dart world. So as we've said several times, back inside of our refresh class right here, we've got the refresh indicator. The onRefresh method right here wants to receive a future. Okay, I can't really mouse over that thing, but you can see that it wants to receive a future. And when that future is resolved, that means that the refresh operation is complete. So at some point in time, we need to get a future into this thing and return it. Now you might notice that inside of our stories block right here, we are calling return on repository.clearCache. And then inside of repository clear cache, we set up this async method. So whenever you use an async method with this async await syntax, if someone ever calls clear cache, even though you and I do not write any code inside of here to indicate it, because we have this await statement right here, it returns a future. So if we called clear cache, because we have await right here, it returns a future. And that future is going to eventually resolve once this await line of code right here is done. So inside of stories block, when we call repository.clearCache, I put on the return keyword right here for a very good reason. Because now that we're calling clear cache, it's going to hit the await keyword inside there. It's going to automatically return a future. and we're going to return that future from clear cache. Then inside of our refresh widget, so here's refresh right here, when we call onRefresh, or when onRefresh gets called, we're going to reach into our block inside of here, and we're going to call that clear cache method we were just looking at. And so the block's clear cache is going to return the future that comes from the repository's clear cache, and that's how we're going to eventually communicate a future back to the onRefresh method right here that is only going to be resolved once the database has been cleared. And once that database has been cleared, that means that we are now ready to have our refresh indicator be dismissed from the screen. So again, the key to all this stuff is kind of understanding how the async await syntax works behind the scenes. Anytime we use that, there's going to be kind of an intermediate return value of a future. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, all we have to do now is inside of our refresh indicator, we're going to reach into the stories block, and we're going to call that new clear cache method that we just added on. So the first thing we have to do inside of here is get access to the block itself. So to get access to our block, we're going to import our stories provider. Remember, here's the stories provider. It has that of method. We pass in some context, and it returns back to us our block. So inside of my refresh class, at the top, I'm going to import blocks stories provider .dart, and then inside of my build method, I'll define a new variable that we'll call final block, and then we'll do stories provider .of context, like so, and that gives us direct access to our block. So then inside of onRefresh, we'll call block.clearCache. And that essentially completes our entire chain here of going from the refresh indicator to the block to the repository to the provider. Now, the last thing we have to do, we need to make sure that when we call clearCache right here, this thing is going to return a future, and we need to communicate that future back to onRefresh. So there's two ways we can do that. To communicate the future back, we can either return the result of clearCache. Alternatively, we could use the async await syntax right here. And again, whenever we use this await syntax, there's an intermediate return value of a future that represents whatever's being done inside this function. So by putting on the await keyword right here, we are essentially awaiting for inside of our repository, here's the clear cache thing, we are essentially awaiting for this cache clear to be resolved. All right, I know that all this kind of async await syntax stuff is kind of nasty, but essentially all we have to do is make sure that we add in all those return keywords to kind of communicate the future all the way back down. So this right here is going to attempt to dump all of our cache, but that's not quite the full story. There's one last thing we have to do. After we go ahead and dump all of our cache, we then have to attempt to communicate some like restart of our application, or attempt to get our application to refetch all those top items. So to get our block to attempt to refetch all those top items, all we have to do is call the fetch top IDs method inside of our stories block again. So when we call fetch top IDs right here, that's going to fetch the top IDs. It's going to add them into the top IDs sync. That's going to wake up our news list screen. So here's our news list screen. It's got the stream builder right here. The stream builder is going to see that top IDs is getting a new set of top IDs inside of it. It's then going to attempt to rebuild our entire list view. The entire list view is going to be rebuilt. It's going to call fetch item right here again with a new set of IDs one by one, and we're going to see a new set of information loaded up into our app. So back inside of our refresh widget, here's the refresh indicator, here's the onRefresh method. After going through the cache dumping process, we'll then do await block.fetch top IDs. And again, we are using the await keyword right here because we want to communicate to the onRefresh method that we need to wait for these top IDs to be fetched before we allow that refresh indicator to go away. All right, so let's save this, and then we'll do a quick test inside of our browser. Excuse me, not the browser, but the emulator. So we'll do a refresh. Now, one thing I want you to see here, I'm going to pull open the latest Hacker News page. And you'll see that over here, we now have a top post of states can require internet collection tax, same one we had before. It's now up to 306 points with 365 comments. So it looks like we successfully did our refresh. So I should now be able to do a drag down. You'll see that I get that refresh indicator right there, and it doesn't actually kick in until I drag all the way down. So I'm going to drag it like all the way down and then let go, and that kicks it in, and then you see all my data just updated. And so I now have 308 points. So the app is now more up to date than the website over here, and I've got the 365 comments that match up with these 365 as well. And that's it. That's how we refresh all the content on the screen. And so now as a user, as many times as they want, they can do that drag and refresh all the data on here. Cool, so that looks good. All right, so I think that we're just about complete with this index screen right here. And it's now just about time to move on to the detail screen. So let's take a quick break, and we'll continue by implementing that detail screen in the next section.